Todd Rokita, and he's going to jump right up here.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that introduction. Hey, listen, I'll get right to it. I know the meeting's already gone on for some time, and I also very aware it's the Christmas season. I also very aware that I am outside of my district tonight, and even though I go to D.C. every week, come back every weekend to be accountable to my wife, my kids, and the voters of Indiana, I am away from them on this weekend night and here sharing the evening with you. And for me, that means two things, really. I come here out of respect for what you're doing. Franklin charged us with keeping the republic. And if the citizens of this country do not get involved, we're going to lose this country. I don't have to tell you that, each one of you, because you're here on a Saturday night during Christmas listening to a guy like me talk. You get it. Each of you have a sphere of influence, your leaders, and you need to be using that sphere. You need to be using your leadership at the dinner table, at the break table at work, at the fence post with the neighbor, everywhere we go. The old adage was, never talk what? Religion or politics. I will set religion aside just for a minute. But if we are not talking politics in every sentence, if we are too shy, if we are too embarrassed, we will lose this country. And we were at that point. That's why I ran for Congress. My agreement tonight to come here, I thank you for the invitation, was to share some data with you from the Budget Committee. We have some slides to do it. It's the same slides I use with town hall meetings, Tea Party events in my 4th district, and then take any question that you want to talk about what the slides generate, about what happened overnight in the United States Senate while we slept, which was shocking to see this morning. Anything you want to talk about, I'll try to give you the most honest answer I can from being in the system, quote unquote, for 11 months and trying to reform it every step of the way. At home we have, in February, my oldest will be 4, my youngest will be 2, we have 2 boys. And like I said, I leave them every week, and I don't want to leave them to do small things. So the other part of the reason I come here tonight is to be accountable to the people of Indiana, whether or not they're in my district. So with that, if everyone can see over my head, okay, if I come down here, I wanted to we'll whip through some of these slides. The first thing, and I'll do this in kind of falsetto fashion, is I put what we're going to talk about in terms of a business. Now, would you invest in a business, would you own a business that had negative cash flow for the past 9 years and a majority of the 50 years before that? Who would invest in that? Who would invest in a company that had negative net worth? Now, that's a fancy, politically correct way for saying bankrupt. Who would invest in a company that had a negative net worth for as long as anyone can remember, and that would need 20 years of income to pay off its current debt if it incurred not 1 cent more of debt? Now, of course, the answer is no one would invest in that company, but the fact of the matter is you already invested in such a country, our country. That's America as if those figures were put in terms of a company. Next slide. This is not a partisan issue. As you can see from this slide, our debt problem has gotten a lot worse in the last 3 years. It's been exacerbated, but it didn't start 3 years ago. And so it's important to remember that all the parties, all the presidents, all the Congresses own this. Terminology, of course, is the debt is actually the sum of every yearly deficit of this country since its inception. So we're running about at least a $1.5 trillion deficit this year. We have for the last 3 years. But all the country's deficits now equal $15 trillion. We have a new day. Remember we had that Tax Freedom Day? I think we celebrated it this year, probably around June or July, when we finally could start working for ourselves, when the government stopped confiscating the property known as dollar bills from us, from our hard work, the fruit of our labor. We have a new day. It's called Debt Day. Today, this year it was July 27th. Every day after July 27th, your federal government ran on money that we borrowed from private citizens or other countries. Next. Another way to look at that is 42 cents of every dollar the federal government spends is borrowed. So we borrow 42% of what we're spending this year alone. Next. We've borrowed before, and we've been in debt before like we are today. When I say before like we are today, I mean that our debt to GDP ratio is in my estimation, about 100% right now. We're $15 trillion in debt, and the value of our GDP is $15 trillion. We were in this situation before. Right after World War II, our debt to GDP ratio was 100%. So why the alarm bells now? We got out of it before. In fact, we got out of it before and became a creditor to the world at the time. Why is Todd Rokita's hair on fire this time? The debt today is much different than the debt that we had after World War II for two reasons. First of all, in World War II, we owed the money to ourselves. Remember the war bond posters? We asked American citizens to pay for the war. And we stepped up and we did it. Today, half of our debt is owed to other countries. People who don't necessarily have, by definition of being another country, our best interest in mind. Huge difference. Huge implications for national security. And the second major difference is the fact that the driver of our debt during World War II is much different than the driver of our debt now. World War II was a one-time event. Everyone knew that one way or another, that war was going to end. The spending would stop, we'd pay it off. That is not the case with what's driving our debt right now. What is driving our debt right now is the fact that we are structurally, operationally spending money we don't have on things that have no end. Unless we as people decide that we're going to stop paying for them and we're going to stop doing. Mainly, the entitlement programs. And yes, I mean to call them entitlement programs. And I'm happy to take your question on why you think, or your comment on why you think they're not an entitlement program, and I'll have an answer for you when you ask that question. There is no end to Medicare, there is no end to Social Security, there is no end to Medicaid, there is no end to the Veterans Benefits Plan. There is no end to the interest we owe over the country's plan. And that mandatory spending is what's driving over 65% of our debt every year. 65% of our federal spending every year, excuse me. Keep going, Tony. This slide we used to kind of put the situation of our debt in. Go back one, Tony. In real terms, with the interest that we pay China alone on the money they lend us, they can buy, if they were in production already, 3 Joint Strike Fighters a week and still have $50 million left over on the money we give them because of our spending habit in the federal government. Next slide. So let's put that in terms of a family budget, because when you get to trillions of dollars, I can't comprehend that. So what I do is I lop 8 zeros off our federal picture. Mr. Obama likes to call, as he said a few months ago, the federal government a federal family. All right, let's look at the family. The family makes $22,000 a year. That's the taxes we collect, revenue. The family spends $37,000 a year. This year, we're going to put $15,000 on the family credit card. By the way, the total outstanding balance on the family credit card, there's only one credit card in this scenario. The outstanding balance on the family credit card is over $145,000. And with all the promises that we made to our spouse and to the kids, if we were to keep those promises, we'd have to put $1 million on the credit card over the next 20, 30 years. But we saved some money. Jim talked about the cuts. We cut some things. That sure is true. And that saved us $3.52. That's the picture. Now, this data I'm showing you isn't Todd Rokita's data. This comes from the Budget Committee. And even the Democrats on the Budget Committee don't dispute the data. They dispute the solution to the problems that the data present. And some Democrats don't think there's a problem. But the data is good data. And you can use it. And this can be made available to you if you'd like it. Next. Here's the drivers of the debt. This is a pie graph that shows everything, top level numbers of what your federal government spends the money on. I moved two pieces of the pie out to show discretionary spending. They call it discretionary because I get to vote on it every year through the budget. If the Senate in nearly 1,000 days now, let's say, doesn't produce a budget, then we're in continuing resolution land. That's all the continuing resolutions are those two pieces of the pie. That's all the budget is, are those two pieces of the pie. So I get to vote every year on what the defense budget should be. And then I get to vote every year on what the non-defense budget should be. And that's the several federal agencies like EPA, Department of Education, Department of Energy. Most of the federal agencies are in that other pulled out piece of the pie. But the rest of the pie, the 65% or so that's all together, I lumped those together to show you that I don't have a say as one of Indiana's representatives on what those amounts should be. That's driven automatically. That's why it's called mandatory. They're on autopilot. The expenditures in these programs are set by the law that form the program. So when you reach age 62 and a half, you get a Social Security check in an amount that was set by the law. When you reach 65, co-payments aside, you are eligible for a fee-for-service healthcare system. You go in for the procedure, it gets paid for. No debate, no questions asked. Fee to the healthcare provider gets paid. And I can't dial that up or dial it down except by changing the underlying law. I can't do it through the budget. So that's the difference there. About this time in the presentation, folks say, hold on, wait a minute. I paid into Social Security. I paid into Medicare. Therefore, I should get out. And that sure is true. Especially those of my generation and younger. We're going to pay in a lot. Everyone's paid in. Let's take the example of Medicare. If you were a couple who through your working lives made about $85,000 a year, you will have paid in about 32% of what you're going to take out of Medicare, of what you've been promised, of what the federal government is legally bound to pay you for your Medicare services. And that roughly 70% gap gets paid for by future generations. That's part of the debt. That's part of the $1 million that's going to be put on the family credit card in the future. So you did pay in. You paid in 30%. The richer of us, to use Mr. Obama's terms, paid in more. The poorer of us paid in less. And the average is 32%. Social Security, very similar. Much better off. We'll be in the same condition Medicare is if we don't reform it. If we don't do common sense things like means test it a little bit more, raise the eligibility age to match more how long we're living. it'll be in the same condition. But right now, Social Security is much better off. It still suffers from the same problem. People are paying in on average 90% of what they're taking out, and that 10% gap is being put on the family credit card. Next. So there's World War II. Here's where we are as about a year ago now, I have to say. The slide's a little bit old. Right now that gray is, like I said, closer to the World War II level. There's the $1 million family credit card. There's the $1 million tap that's coming. That's the future promises that have been made under these healthcare programs, under these social insurance programs, the interest that we owe ourselves and other countries that will go up eventually because of all the money we're printing now. That's all coming. This is the red menace that the governor mentions in his book and when he makes speeches about it. This is what we're talking about. It's one thing to have $15 trillion in debt now, but what's coming down the road will surely swamp us if we don't get a hold of it now, if we don't make reforms now to ward that off. There's a cost for doing nothing, and the cost is about $12 trillion a year. Every year we wait, the present day value of those future promises costs $12 trillion. It doesn't mean the debt's going to go up $12 trillion next year. It just means the total cost to solve the problem every year we wait goes up $12 trillion. The cost of the benefits, if we don't reform them, goes up $12 trillion. Next. I often, I often get questions about solutions. So let me go through some what I think are false solutions, and you can debate those with me if you'd like afterwards. The first false solution was this Budget Control Act, otherwise known as the debt ceiling increase in early August. It didn't solve anything, as we now know, I hope. So, just a few days after the debt ceiling, it was agreed to raise the debt ceiling, we were downgraded by one rating agency. Others made note that if we don't change our ways, if we don't put us on a path to solving the problem, to solving the debt problem, they are going to do the same thing eventually. The super committee didn't do its job. That shouldn't surprise, it didn't surprise me, it shouldn't surprise anyone in this room. They were simply a microcosm of the larger body. And we can't, as you know, agree on much these days. Cannot get consensus on cutting government spending or raising the revenue and taxes to try to pay for some of this. So false solution number one was the quote-unquote debt deal. It was a Washington deal. It was not a solution. Number two, let's talk about raising taxes. Let's talk about more revenue. This is I need to correct myself. There's one of these slides, this one, does not come from the Budget Committee. This comes from the Wall Street Journal. That's where I found it. They say they got their source from the IRS. This is a bar graph that shows the distribution of revenue among tax brackets. It's not tax brackets, but among income levels. So you can see that the middle class, those that make anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000, have the dollar bills in this country. That's who physically possesses most of the country's money. So when President Obama and others talk about taxing the rich to solve the debt problem, you can see that taxing the rich means going right to the middle in order to get enough dollars to make any difference in the debt. If you stay to the most right 3 or 4, 5 bars, that's 1 million to 10 million. If you took if you confiscated, as the government, 100% of everything those people produced every year and assumed two things, that they would continue to produce and that they would stay in this country, you wouldn't have enough dollar bills. There's not enough Oprah Winfrey's, there's not enough baseball players. And when I'm in Lafayette, I said there's not enough Purdue coaches, okay, that have that kind of wealth to pay the debt. When anyone says about going to the rich to pay their fair share for the debt, they're coming to you. They're coming to the middle class. They're going to have to by definition. Next. Some people say let's get rid of earmarks. We did. Even in the appropriations bill that I voted on this week, there was not an earmark in it. That's a huge radical change, and people ought to be given credit for that. Get rid of foreign aid. Absolutely. I'm tired of giving money to people who aren't being helpful to us. It should be looked at. That should be reformed. But I don't want anyone to leave here and think, if we just got rid of earmarks, if we just got rid of foreign aid, our debt problem would be solved, because that's not the case. Again, both should be looked at, both should be reformed. But if you had 0 earmarks and 0 foreign aid that you gave out, you'd solve 2% of our spending. Again, it comes back to those social insurance programs and healthcare programs. Let's cut defense. Okay, let's look at that. It's a $700 billion operation a year, not including the special contingency for the wars. That's just the Pentagon's operating. $700 billion. You bet there's waste, fraud, and abuse in there. And we have got to change the culture in this country and in Washington so that the generals don't come to the representatives threatening and scaring and starting everyone's hair on fire saying, you got to give us more money or you'll hurt the troops. That's a straw man. That's wrong. The Department of Defense is one of the worst bureaucracies in Washington, and they're all bad. They're all wasteful. If those leaders, if those generals would turn their attention and focus on stretching the dollar and getting that dollar to the warfighter, they could easily do it. There's enough fat in there. And that's what we need to demand. We do need to reform the Defense Department. But let's say we had no Pentagon, and putting the constitutional duty aside, the one constitutional duty perhaps for the federal government, the first constitutional duty for the federal government, our national defense. Putting that aside, let's say there's no Pentagon. Let's say there's no Department of Defense. You'd save 20% of what you're spending. So again, these solutions in and of themselves are not going to solve our deficit or debt problem. Next. Solutions that we think do work. And this was part of the Ryan budget. I'm on the budget committee. There's 3 representatives from Indiana on the budget committee. We think that if you gave people more choice in the Medicare system, let consumerism take over, right? We go down the street here and we can know the price of a set of 4 tires at any one of the shops. We have an innate ability to find value because of our free enterprise system. And that's in every one of us. We don't unleash that consumerism onto the healthcare system. I severed my Achilles tendon over Memorial Day weekend, just now, getting off crutches. Had a surgery, they went into my leg, repaired it. I have no idea. And by the way, I'm not on the federal insurance, I'm on a COBRA from the state. So it's not a federal thing. You wouldn't have any, I had no idea what that cost. I didn't go from hospital to hospital or surgery center to surgery center pricing everything out. I just went. Well, sometimes there's emergencies, you gotta go to the emergency room, you're not gonna have time to do that. But really, if you look at it, very few of our medical procedures are emergencies. You do have a chance to be that consumer. So what we're saying is, let's have the people of this country have 9 insurance policies to choose from. Let's give a stipend to that insurance company to pay for it. You can choose a Cadillac plan, and maybe the federal government stipend won't cover all of it. You can have a bare bones catastrophic plan to cover the most serious emergencies, and the federal stipend will more than cover it. But you would be able to choose based on your individual situation what is best for you. Not a one-size-fits-all government program where a bureaucrat decides what operation you're good for, what operation you're not. And by doing this, you would get the federal government out of the business of defined benefits. Just like the pension system was reformed years ago and put us all on 401ks, where companies gave a defined contribution. Here it would be a defined contribution from the federal government. Here's the stipend, pick the insurance plan you want that best fits your needs. No insurance company could exclude you that participated in the program. So no one would be excluded. But that would allow the federal government to know exactly what its cost is every year and not have an endless fee-for-service program that promotes overconsumption, abuse, waste, those kinds of things. Spent way too much time on that. Social Security is really one of the easiest ones to reform. There's very few dials to move. Either you're talking about raising the eligibility age, or you're talking about putting a more aggressive means test on it. Now, even Franklin, the socialist, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, intended the Social Security scheme to be an insurance program. What were we insuring against? Living in poverty in our old age. And over time, that social insurance program has become an annuity, an investment. I paid in, therefore I get out. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt started the program, the payout age was 65, and the average age of an American was 58. He had a good deal. Hardly anyone lived long enough to get a Social Security check. Now the average age of an American is 78, and we pay out at a lower age, 62 and a half. It is unsustainable. When Roosevelt started the program, there were 100 workers for every retiree. Now there's 3, and in 15 to 20 years there'll be 2. And then growing the economy. Now, because this is not the 1980s anymore, you cannot just grow the economy to get rid of this kind of debt, and especially get rid of what the tidal wave that's coming is. It can help, but we can't just grow our way out of this. You will have to cut spending in order to survive that tidal wave. And with that, I'll stop for a while and happy to take